Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drum McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at thechangeleader.com. This episode of Changing Higher Ed is sponsored by Perdea Education, a national leader in online student recruitment and enrollment services, providing institutions enrolled students risk-free on a performance-based model with no long-term contract. If your online programs could benefit from incremental online student enrollments, visit PerdeaEducation.com. That's P-E-R-D-I-A education.com. And now, here's your host, Drum McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our special guest today is Bill Coletti, president of Kith Communications. Bill is a crisis communications and reputational management expert with more than 25 years of experience managing high-stakes crises, issues management, and media relations challenges for Fortune 500 companies and global political campaigns, and also higher education institutions. Bill has provided senior counsel in crisis management, corporate communications, and reputation defense to clients including AT&T, Cargill, the College Board, Target, American Airlines, the Home Depot, American Express. The list goes on, and these include a number of major universities here in the U.S. Bill joins us today to discuss how colleges and universities can improve their communications in times of crisis and overall. Bill, welcome to the show.
Drum, it's my honor to be here. I'm looking forward to a great conversation with you.
Oh, likewise. And with so many different things going on in higher ed right now, I mean, we're all sick and tired of hearing about COVID, but it's still here. We've got all of the challenges with Black Lives Matter, the racial inequities, etc. And now we've got an election coming up. Your topic, reputation management and crisis management, is more critical now than I think it's ever been in the history of higher ed.
Yeah, I think, and add to that the normal dynamics that were in place for higher ed around shrinking enrollment and the changing the way that content was delivered, and meaning online. So yeah, there is a lot of change going on, change that was already going to happen, but change that's really been accelerated, particularly acutely for higher ed in 2021 and beyond.
And I think it's going to continue. I mean, one of my favorite guests on the show is Gordon Gee, the president of West Virginia. And Gordon has said COVID has accelerated the needed changes in higher ed by a decade or more.
Yeah, I think there was a slow march towards change, and now it's been a much faster jump off a cliff towards change because of COVID.
It's crazy. There's more fear out there in higher ed than I've ever sensed in my entire career.
Yeah, but Drum, one of the things that's interesting is we observe this, and I don't know if you've seen it over the past 6 months per se. I haven't seen a dramatic increase of either bankruptcies or companies or higher education institutions dissolving. Maybe I've missed some of those headlines, but have you seen sort of ultimate death sentences for institutions over the past 6 months directly related to COVID, or have people pivoted and adapted sufficiently?
They have pivoted to some degree, but I think it's going to accelerate the rate of closures. I know we're seeing more mergers now, which is obviously another area in which crisis communications is important.
Yeah.
But I think because the enrollment is down anywhere from 5 to 10%, and we're headed to what's called the enrollment cliff, where the birth rate for the traditional age college students wasn't there, so there are less students being sought after by universities. I think we're going to see more of it in the next 1 to 3 years.
Yeah, and I think that's something that everybody should keep an eye on as a very interesting sort of tell about what the future is going to look like.
And now you work primarily with the C-suite and boards with helping them through these type of events, i.e., say an institution wanted to merge with another institution. And so you work with the communications. Tell us a little bit about what you do with an institution similar to that or something else.
Fundamentally, we do crisis communications and reputation management, and one is kind of born from the other. So we've done some work with large universities with some of the sexual harassment challenges that they've had to do, both related to the athletic department as well as faculty and staff. And so those sort of higher ed's not immune to the Me Too movement at all. And so we've done a lot of those crisis moments. Then a lot of what you've talked about in this sort of mergers and acquisitions of how do you tell the story of the benefit, either whether you're acquired or acquiring, or you're changing your footprint and facilities, perhaps like moving your campus. So a lot of that sort of repositioning, doing the communications. And in the long term, it's about how do you grow and expand from those crisis events to grow reputation long term. We are a high strategy, low tactic firm. We spend a lot of time with the C-suites and boards of directors figuring out how to tell a story to multiple stakeholders, the folks that really matter most. How do you tell those stories? So, we do a handful of different things that we do for clients. We also do a lot of crisis simulations where we actually work with leadership teams and actually simulate an event. We do training and coaching for communicators and leaders on how do they actually show up in a time of a crisis. And then we do a lot of sort of longer term reputation management over the long term.
So we all know how a crisis can impact the university's reputation. You don't have to look any further really than University of Michigan with everything that happened there. But how do you turn something around when you have such a negative perception from the public and from your stakeholders? What are some of the steps that you would do to drive that?
Yeah, terrific question. We talked earlier about my book. And so the model of the book is this concept of the 4 A's of reputation management. And so they're what I believe to be the 4 steps that the University of Michigan, perfect example, these are the steps that they should take. And it kind of was born out of a conversation that I had with the CEO, a female, wonderful CEO at her company had gone through a crisis event. And I was trying to explain to her what I meant by reputation management. She challenged me, similar to your question, to what are those concrete things that we could do. Her team was suggesting, much like I'm sure others at the University of Michigan were suggesting, well, let's just go do this. Let's go do this thing. Let's really focus on sexual harassment or the safety of our students. Let's immediately jump to an action. And so I recommend a 4-step process. And the 4-step process is it's basically 4 A's. And the first one is awareness, is that before you go on a reputation management journey, you need to be self-aware and really sort of aware of the needs of those that matter most to you. And so that's simply by popping your head up, looking around, what is the state of play? Where are we right now? Is sexual harassment the issue, or is it more about governance that's there? Or is it simply about gender issues? So it's this notion of awareness, who are we and what can we talk about? After that, it's assessment. From running political campaigns for a long time, and I'm sure you can relate to this, we don't have to guess on strategy. We can actually ask stakeholders. We can actually ask those that matter to us and actually learn, and that's the assessment phase. So that is good internal and external public opinion and understanding from an assessment standpoint. What can we learn from people? Third is authority. You can't go on a reputation management journey unless you have buy-in from your board and from your presidency or whatever shared governance model that you have with other folks. Could be faculty or the governor's office or whatever the case may be. But authority is the next step. So the sum of awareness and assessment, then you go to authority, you get this yielding and an understanding of clarity before you actually take action. And you'll notice on the cover of the book, there's a solid blue line above those 3 issues. That's to keep guys like me and well-intentioned consultants from saying, well, just go do this, write a big check to the United Way, or go start a department on this, and immediately jumping to action. Unless you've done the work of assessment, awareness, and authority, unless you've done the work, you can't jump to action. So there's 4 logical steps, and then within action, there's a lot of detail. about the things that actually move reputational levers, what I believe are the levers of reputation. So those are the 4 A's that I think are the critical steps for anybody that wants to go on a reputation management journey.
Well, it makes sense when I take a look at on a shooting range, which may not be the best analogy. You have ready, aim, fire. That's what you're trying to get folks to do instead of ready, fire, aim.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
The American way, and if you've done any work, if listeners have done any work with project management, you have the Project Management Institute and their PMP certification. One of the things that they talk about as you're going through for that credential is the difference between the American way of doing things and the Japanese way of doing things. The Japanese put a tremendous amount of effort into the planning, just similar to what you were talking about. What is it you're going to do? Why are you doing it? How are you going to do it? The 6 sisters of journalism, as you wish. Whereas the Americans tend to just jump in and they end up spending more on their projects and the projects take longer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The way I talk about it, I love that the Japanese analogy is that I love this phrase that I think I came up with is move fast, but don't break things. And so Facebook, if you're familiar with Zuckerberg, and so the pushback on the statement that you just made is that, no, we want to be fast and agile and we want to fail fast and then we want to go ahead and do that. And I go, that's fine in a manufacturing construct or if you've got an app or a new technology. But if you are a large, sophisticated battleship that most major institutions of higher education are, they are multivariant, multi-stakeholder, multi-funders, lots of different various components. You don't turn that battleship the same way you do with a new app that we're throwing up on the App Store. And so move fast, but don't break things. And so I like to talk about it in this concept of transformation. And so if you take Mark Zuckerberg, which is move fast and break things, that's their actual, one of their mottos. And then the way Warren Buffett looks at it is long-term, slow growth. And we're going to grow and earn our reputation block by block, brick by brick over time. I think there's a middle ground where you can move fast, but don't break things. And that's where the 4 A's model comes in with that discipline that you're articulating in that contrast between this American way and Japanese way. It doesn't mean paralysis through analysis. It means let's be thoughtful. Let's be smart. We can be quick, but at least let's ask a few questions before we decide to go close the chemistry department and offer an MBA. We should maybe think about that a little bit.
Maybe, because your chemistry majors could blow the place up.
Exactly.
Literally and figuratively.
Exactly.
Well, it kind of reminds me of a saying that we used to have in the Navy, which I will sanitize for listeners. It says, 10 attaboys are great, but 1 aw shucks wipes the slate clean.
Absolutely.
And when it comes to reputation management, you cannot afford to go out and fail fast. Mm-hmm. You need to understand, because it's that, when those first impressions are lasting, well, mm-hmm. when you have something like this, whether it be a Me Too movement, whether it be COVID, whether it be elections, Black Lives Matter, it doesn't really matter. These are issues that are core to people's being.
Yes.
And if you don't go the right way and you end up stepping on people's feet, I'm not talking toes, I'm talking feet, then it's going to stay with you a long time.
It is. So we, our firm's been in existence for 6 years, and I've been doing this from a corporate context for about 15, is that, I made this articulation around risk. So underpinning what you just talked about are risks, okay, broadly defined. We defined it as 3 different types of risk. We had strategic risks, which are things you intended to do. We intend to open a new campus, go online, shut down this offering, whatever we intended to do. We're doing it from some sort of superior strategic objective. We are trying to grow our enterprise by taking on this risk. Preventable risks are risks that you should simply have zero tolerance for. Okay, sexual harassment of faculty to student, crime and violence in the facilities that you own, racism on campus. Those are preventable risks that simply should not happen. And then there's external things just outside of your control and the community that you really can't directly control. And so active shooter, it's really, really difficult. You can put procedures in place, but you can't stop someone from walking on your campus with a gun. And so those are external. So you have strategic, preventable, and external. What you're talking about, and is the new framework that we're thinking about it, is this whole construct of what we call social risk. And these are risks that directly impact populations and directly impact groups. And higher ed is acutely aware of strategic, preventable, and external. You can buy insurance or you can mitigate those risks. These social risks that you just talked about, that's the new frontier of where people are going to stub their toe or step on feet, as you said. That's where that comes from. And so thinking about these risks that impact populations is the next frontier that presidents and boards need to be thinking about when they used to be thinking about facilities, football, and faculty. It's actually now a much different paradigm. They need to be thinking about populations.
Well, that goes back to your 4A's, the awareness and the assessment. I think
Absolutely.
University presidents and boards, their job is difficult anyway, but I think it's become even more difficult with this rapid change caused by COVID and by all the social issues that are coming up.
Absolutely. And so what we really believe is that through awareness and assessment is, where do we stand? Where do we stand on Black Lives Matter? Where do we stand in that, both capital B, Black Lives Matter, or lowercase Black Lives Matter? Where do we stand on the group, the institution, or not institution, or where do we stand on the concept that's there? Where do we stand on these LGBTQ issues? I think we're going to see a reemergence around other social issues. Schools and higher ed need to make thoughtful decisions about. And I'd rather do it while the sun is shining as opposed to doing it in the darkness of a storm. Let's talk about these values now, and let's understand, where do we stand on these issues of populations? Where do we stand on these, what we call social risks?
Mm-hmm. One of the things that really struck me when you and I spoke last week was the leadership that is expected and critical in one of these challenges, one of these crises. Mm-hmm. And you made a statement: the crucible of crisis does not develop leadership skills, it reveals it. Talk a little bit more about that, if you would.
Yeah, so I don't believe that for these large crises events that truly are reputational defining, just use Michigan as a really good example of that, is that I don't believe there's on-the-job training. I think what there is that these are such soul-bearing emotions, such soul-bearing moments, that the core nature of the leadership that's in place. So I don't think you learn how to develop these skill sets in the moment. Your character is just simply revealed. And so the point of the crucible crisis doesn't develop your leadership, it reveals it. It very quickly, in clear relief, as you are stripped naked and standing there needing to make decisions in a critically difficult time and stand up and articulate a path forward, is that it reveals that. The remedy is, A, be really clear about what you stand for. Be very self-aware, have high EQ, and a real understanding of, where do I, as a man or a woman, a leader, where do we stand on this particular issue? And then secondly, practice. Ask my team, how's this going to work? What if this would happen? If you're at any school and you said, if Michigan were to happen to us, what would we do? If Virginia Tech back in the day, if that were to happen to us, what would we do? If we had this challenge with our our athletic program, what would we do? I think that's ask about key takeaways. It's simply to ask, practice, and prepare.
Well, it's interesting that you bring this up, because this morning the news came out that the president of Virginia Military Institute resigned. Mm-hmm. And, systemic racism throughout. Yep. And the cadets, the black cadets, raised up their arms. I mean, you would not have seen this 5 years ago.
Yep. You wouldn't have seen it generally, and you probably wouldn't have seen it specifically at a VMI. So, yeah, so you're absolutely, absolutely correct. And so that leadership, those leaders, what was core to them was revealed in that moment. And so that's very telling.
It's interesting because one of the things I tell boards is in doing governance work with them, everybody is a reporter. Everybody has a cell phone that can record video, audio, whatever. Mm-hmm. And so don't think any moment is off the record. It is all on the record.
Absolutely critical.
Talk to that. How do you get people prepared for this kind of crisis?
Yeah. So we believe that simulations, crisis simulations, the industrial industries, manufacturing, folks that are industrial, either through OSHA or our other government regulators, have a requirement of actually doing health and safety simulations. And if you're an energy, oil and gas company, you do these things. Those same types of exercises can be done on reputational challenges to make sure that you're really well aligned. And so I think it's really fundamentally do simulations, do practice, and exercise your team. The objective, the rationale, and the why behind all of that is the key differentiator in these critical moments that we talk about, that you and I are talking about now. The key differentiator is speed. How fast are you able to respond to fill the vacuum? Because you talked about citizen journalism, everybody's got a camera. That is just exacerbating speed. So the key differentiator between good and great response is speed. I've come up with a formula that the way you get fast is that your mission and values plus your chain of command equals speed. So if you talked about President Gee, he's one of the best in really knowing what he as a man stands for and what his institutions stand for. So mission and values are critically clear, and that's great. But if a crisis had impacted him in the first couple of weeks at his new institution, chain of command was still sorting itself out. There was an old president, a new president, so there's vulnerability around chain of command. So I think that organizations should really focus on what do they stand for, mission and values, crystal clear about chain of command. And what I mean by chain of command is who makes decisions, informal and formal org charts, outside advisors, guys like you and me, outside legal counsel, how do they impact that? Because they will slow you down in order to be fast. So if you know what you stand for and you know who makes decisions, that'll make you fast in these crisis situations.
And of course, we don't want to fail fast. We just want to go fast.
Absolutely. Yeah, we want to move fast, but don't break things. Move fast, but don't break things.
And so it's an interesting conundrum because, especially with higher ed, where you have shared governance and you have so many faculty under the guise of academic freedom, faculty feel like they can come out and say anything. Mm-hmm. And they don't realize that in a crisis like this, all they're doing is making it worse for themselves and everybody else at the institution. Mm-hmm. How do you deal with those kind of things?
It's interesting, and we've dealt with that both at the higher ed level and in other institutions, is that we need to, first of all, accept that as a fact. We need to know that that's going to happen. We can't be in denial that that's going to happen. So if you do a good job, I don't love the word stakeholder. I think it's kind of overused, but I like the simplicity of the phrase matters most. If you've done the work to really determine who matters most, you're always communicating and you're remaining engaged with those that matter most, you shouldn't be surprised. You shouldn't be surprised when things like this happen, when there's commentary and those freedoms and those liberties are acted upon, and you're ready. And so that's why simulations and trainings are so critically important, because you can mimic that, you can model that, and then people, the president's office or the board can actually say, okay, this is what they're going to do, a little bit of chess, here's what the next move is going to be, and here's how we're going to respond. And so I don't believe that in a shared governance model, I don't believe in a respect of those that matter most, that you're going to squelch that. You just need to be able to respond to it and predict it. And so that's for the guidance we give our clients, is that we got to be smart about it, because we're not just going to squelch it. We can blow it off, but we're not just going to make it go away. We need to be able to be predictive and react to it.
Well, what about having policies in your institution that's saying in a time of a crisis, if the president says we're in crisis mode to the entire faculty, staff, et cetera, that there's one spokesman on this, the president or the board chair. Is that a good strategy to have?
Totally a good strategy. Absolutely a good strategy. The challenge is not everybody's definition of a crisis is the same thing. So back to that strategic, preventable, and external. Strategic things you're meant to do for superior gain, preventable shouldn't happen, and external outside of your control. It's my experience that a policy like that around external events, something that weather related, force majeure, active shooter on campus, everybody can quickly rally around that and embrace that policy. Okay? But if the crisis is of our own making because of a strategic risk, we decided to expand or shrink, offer a new program or whatever the case may be, whatever we decide to do in our offering, a policy like that is really, really hard to enforce because everybody's going to have an opinion on that. So it goes to around the definition of a crisis. And so let's take Michigan, all right? If we had a policy like that in place, that says, hey, as we go through this moment right now, the only one speaking on behalf of the university is the president, I am not sure that everybody would be on that bandwagon. To your question, yes, those types of policies are good. Don't hang your hat that that's going to be the ace in the hole that, okay, I got this all taken care of, because there are too many crises, too many topics that are there. So what's my job and what we do with our clients is help them try to predict, like we were talking about before, who those that matter most and what are they going to say.
And so who should be the spokesperson, the board chair or the university president?
Really depends on the situation. Really depends on the situation. I just watched the 30 for 30 documentary about Bobby Knight at the University of, at Indiana. They were very confused. You had the board chairman running an investigation. You had the president talking about some things, and then you had a head of communications. And sometimes it didn't seem like everybody was on the same page there. I think that it's very situational. I think at the end of the day, it's the president's responsibility for day-to-day functionality of the institution, that the president represents the CEO of that institution. And so I think they should be your first line of defense. But I don't think they have to be the only line of defense. I think you can use others. You can use a provost. You can use a dean. And what that does strategically, from my standpoint, is it actually ring fences the crisis, that this is important. So a senior leader is responding to it, but keeping the president or CEO off to the sidelines, because that is your most precious asset to be used. So I don't think there's a universal answer. It needs to be someone significant in the organization. It could be a second or third or general counsel. It really depends on the topic.
So we don't need any Alexander Haig moments, I'm in charge.
Not at all. And that's why simulations and training, back to mission and chain of command, that's why chain of command is critically important, because you can experiment with how things are actually going to work and get leadership teams to actually work on that stuff.
That's great. Well, we're coming up to the end of our time. Unfortunately, this has been a fascinating conversation for me. What would you say are 3 takeaways for university presidents if they end up having a event happen, a crisis that they need to deal with?
So first of all, recognizing that speed is imperative. So understand that, keep that in the back of your mind, that speed is critically important. Next is this notion of what do we stand for? Who are we? What are our mission and values? What do we really, really believe in? And what do I, as the leader, what do I believe in? And how is that going to push through and permeate through my organization? And then lastly is this notion of chain of command. Who's involved? Who are the critical decision makers when the time comes? How does that both respect my C-suite or my leadership team, but also our shared governance model? And if you're a big public institution, the governor of your state's probably going to have an opinion about what's going on. And then even more simply, what I would do, even if you're not a big public institution, but you're a regional or smaller institution, pull out the Chronicle of Higher Education, pull out the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and say, if this had happened to us, what would we do? And so I think the simplest of simple is at a monthly staff meeting or more often if you see fit, simply ripped from the headline and said, if VMI had happened to us, when we're talking about Virginia military, if that had happened to us, what would we do? And so I think that's the simplest of simple takeaways, is that do planning, do training, do simulations so that you're not thinking about this stuff while the bright lights are on. You're thinking about it in the coolness of a nice day, as opposed to when the heat is on.
As that saying goes, prior planning prevents poor performance.
Absolutely. I think there's another P in there, but yeah, I agree.
Yeah, well, we're trying to clean it up. And so what's next for you, Bill, for Kith? What's next?
Yeah, so it's really exciting. Thank you very much for asking that. So for our journey as Kith, we have really been firefighters. We have been exclusively doing crisis response, the things that you and I have been talking about. As institutions find themselves in challenging moments, we've come running as firefighters. And so we call that crisis response. For 2021, we're really going to expand into 3 additional areas of the way we serve people. So we're going to serve people in their situation, which is crisis response. We're going to serve people in their teams, which is really working with leadership teams, specifically on simulations and crisis planning. We're going to work with individuals on coaching and what we call Kith Academy, which is really developing the mindset and behavior of great communications. And then we're going to work with the organization about a transformation journey. What is a long-term engagement of how can we actually transform and grow reputation over the long term? And so those 3 things of who we serve, ranging from we're going to serve you in the moment, we're going to serve you individually, your team, and your organization. That's the new frontier for us as a firm, and trying to do a little bit less firefighting.
That'd be great. And so we'll have to check in with you mid-next year and see how all that's going.
It's going to be exciting. We're excited that we can serve different organizations in different ways.
Well, Bill, thanks so much for being on the show. It's been great having you and great conversation.
Well, Drum, thank you for what you do. I've listened to a number of your episodes. You share some great insight for higher ed leadership. So thank you for what you do.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening this week. And a special thank you to this week's special guest, Bill Coletti, President of Kith, and for his sharing his thoughts on crisis communications and reputation management. I also want to give a special shout out to our new sponsor, Perdea Education. Visit perdeaeducation.com, that is PERDIA education.com, to learn how they can help you grow your online student enrollment through a performance-based model with no risk or long-term contract for your institution. Our next guest is Mike Goldstein, former managing partner at Cooley LLP and now the managing director of the Center for Higher Education Transformation at Triton Partners. Mike will be joining us to discuss the possible implications for higher ed as a result of the recent elections. And with Mike's insights into Washington, I know this is going to be a great show.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drum McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.